Alright guys, today I'm going to be making a slimline pen, 7mm tubes made out of Bocote wood. The first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that your pen kit has everything in it and that the brass tubes are the same length. If they're the exact same length, just grab one of them and lay it on your wood blank. As I'm using here, I'm using Bocote wood for this project, but you're going to want to grab a pen blank and lay it one end of the pen blank on the end of the wood and then mark where the end of the tube is. Next, you're going to want to get to some sort of saw. Now, I'm just using like a $10 hand hacksaw, miter saw assembly from Harbor Freight, which works amazing, believe it or not. So get your saw ready, and the first mark that you made, ignore it for a second. Go to the second mark, which is towards the end of your pen blank. Cut that one off first. So line it up and cut it. And after you get that one cut, that little 1 inch or whatever remainder wood, you can either save or throw away or whatever. I like to save those to eventually glue together and make another pen out of all the leftover pen blanks. After you've made your first cut, move on to your second one. So line up your second mark and cut the two blanks in half. After you've cut the two blanks in half, in theory they will be the same length or roughly the same length. They don't have to be exact, as long as they are the same length as the brass tubes or longer. After you get the two blanks, you're going to want to get a corner finder, which you can buy those at wood places, wood distributors, woodworking shops. I actually 3D printed this one because I have a 3D printer, which it works amazing. I did a high infill density, so it's sturdy plastic and it works great. But just make sure you have a nice corner finder and mark the center of your wood. Now, I do all four corners, and the reason is in case one of my blanks is not a perfect square or cube, I should say, rectangle. At least by doing all four corners, even though there's variations in your lines that you marked, you can take the average and it'll kind of create a center mark for you. After you've done this to both pieces of the blank, you're going to start with one of them on the drill press. You can use whatever kind of drill press you want, but it needs to be a drill press. Try not to do this with a hand cordless drill or even a hand drill. Make sure you do it with a drill press. Well, you're going to drill out the center hole all the way through the piece of wood. Make sure you go slow and easy here, and it's very important because the wood is so small, and even though you are probably using hardwood, they can end up splitting the blank because the wood is so small. So if it heats up inside of there, you're not cleaning out your bit, it could create the wood to split, and then you just wasted however much money you spent on that pen blank. So drill out both pieces of your blank and set those aside for now. The next thing that you're going to want to do is to take some sandpaper and get both of your brass tubes and sand the edges all the way around those brass tubes. So you're purposely causing a small amount of damage to these tubes, and the reason is because those tubes are slick on the outside. Once you start gluing, you're going to want something for that glue to stick to. So you're wanting to create a rough edge around the outside of both tubes so that they can be secured inside the pen blank. Once you've roughed both outsides of those brass tubes, I would recommend putting on rubber gloves for the next step, just because I use CA glue, and you can use the same thing if you would like. I recommend it. You can use about any brand. I use the Stick Fast brand. But once you get your gloves on, you're going to want to get your CA glue out and kind of coat the inside of the wood, the pen blank. So just kind of squirt some glue in there, roll the tube around where it kind of goes around all sides of the inner diameter of that pen blank in the hole. Once you do that, you can coat the brass tubes with glue as well. It's not going to hurt anything to add excess, so that's why I'd recommend wearing gloves, just to keep that CA glue off of your hands. Kind of a side note, the CA glue, if it gets on your hands, the only thing that will take it off is acetone or obviously fingernail polish remover. Other than that, there's not a lot that will take that off, and it will actually tear your skin off before it breaks the seal of the glue. Once you get the glue lathered up on the tubes and inside the wood blank, you can go ahead and slowly push the brass tubes into the wood blanks. There's going to be some excess glue come out. That's perfectly fine. One side of your tube is going to be flush with the end of your wood blank. The other one is going to set in from the end of the wood blank, and that's okay. So once the glue is dry, you're just going to run the tube cleaner bit in and out of the brass tubes a couple times just to clean any hardened glue out of there, because you're going to want a crisp and clean surface on the inside of those brass tubes. The end mill you're going to use on the end, so you want to enter from the end that you did not stick the tube into. So whatever end that you put the tube into, you want to use the other end of the wood blank. And the reason is because that's the end of the wood blank that is set out and not flush with the end of the brass tube. For pin turning, as I'm sure you know, you will need a pin mandrel. They can be found online everywhere, as well as most woodshop woodworking supply stores. This is a personal preference, but the way I like to utilize my bushings when turning pins is to put one bushing on the mandrel and then put my first pin blank. Now I like to use the end of the pin blank that was already flush with the end of the brass tubes. I like to put that all the way towards the active head of the lathe against the bushing. So you put your first pin blank on, you're going to put another bushing, and then you're going to put your second pin blank on, and I put it opposite so that the end that you use the end mill on is facing the center, and the end that was already flush is facing your dead end of the lathe. After you put your second wood blank on there, you're going to put your third bushing on, and then use your screw fitting to secure to the end of the mandrel. You might have to use your control wheel on the end of your lathe as well as that screw fitting to truly tighten up everything. You want to make sure there's a secure tightness and threaded as far as it can go by hand. Now, there's no need for pliers or tools, but as long as you can get it pretty tight by hand, you'll be okay. After that, you're ready to bring up the dead end, non-active end of your lathe into the end of the pin mandrel. Once the end of your lathe, the dead end is into your pin mandrel, you can tighten everything up and you're ready to start turning. Just make sure you get your tool guard and tool rest ready to start turning as close as you can. Would be the easiest way to turn without obviously hitting the wood. Once everything's set in place, you're ready to turn the lathe on and start turning your pins. For pin turning, a lot of guys do different things. They have a whole set of lathe chisels to use, and I have the same set. However, I usually just use a medium-sized roughing gouge throughout the entire process of turning the pins. If you're able to control your tools and use them correctly, I don't see why it would be hard to use one chisel throughout the whole process instead of switching from a roughing gouge to a skew to a point load, etc. You can lay the backside of your chisel on the wood blanks, and if the chisel just sits on the wood, then you know it's a round object. If it bounces up and down, you still have rough edges or corners or even still a cube. Once you get down pretty close with your wood blanks, you're getting ready to stop turning the lathe. You just want to check to make sure that you do not turn the pin down so far that it goes to the brass tube. If so, you will be losing out on a brass tube and a wood blank because there's really no coming back from that. Once your wood blank is turned down to size, you can turn off the lathe, take a quick glance to make sure you have everything where you want it, in the shape that you want it, and no rough edges. Next thing that I do is use 3 grits of sandpaper, from super rough and coarse to a medium grade and then to a fine grit sandpaper. I lightly apply each individual grits to both wood blanks, both sections of the pin, just to get any rough edges kind of knocked down. You can apply moderate pressure, but too less of pressure will not do much, and too much obviously could cause problems with the wood blank being turned down too small. After I use the sandpaper, I have a whole set of micro mesh sanding pads that range from 1200 grit all the way up to 12,000 grit, and I go through the entire set on both pin blanks. I don't spend long on each blank with each pad, but I just do a light amount of pressure covering the whole pin blank just to get any fine rough edges taken care of. Once you're done going through the entire set of the micro mesh pads and you turn your lathe off and look at your pins, they will be pretty shiny and almost to a finished condition. To put icing on the cake, or to put polish on the pins in this case, I use a friction polish wood turned finish. The way you finish your pins is totally up to you. Some people use CA glue as a finished product and no polish. Some people use stain and then polish, then CA glue. Some people use polish and then CA glue. I've done it multiple ways. The way I find best is just using CA glue without any polish or any stain, or simply using a friction polish, which I'm going to do on this pin. The way a friction polish works is once you apply the polish to the pin blanks, you want to apply a slight amount of pressure with your towel or with your rag. The heat that is created by you applying pressure is what actually dries the polish. That's why it's a friction polish. It is designed to dry and cure as heat and friction is applied. The beauty of this is that after you've done this, that polish is automatically cured and dry. There's no waiting around for anything to dry. After you've polished both of your blanks and you're to a finished condition, you can take both blanks off of the lathe If you're using two different types of wood, in this case we're not, we started with one pin blank, but if you're using two different types of wood, you want to make sure that the orientation of your pin blanks is memorized, or you write it down just to make sure that you don't switch up the end of the pin versus the front, etc. After you have both pin blanks off of the lathe, I like to screw the end thread back on just enough to where the end of the mandrel sticks through. The next step is not the correct way to do this, but I don't have any fancy adapters or a store-bought pin press, so I simply use my lathe to build the pin. I like to start with the nib of the pin and apply pressure on the lathe and stick that in the end of the first pin blank. After you've applied pressure and have the nib installed into the end of the pin blank, you can install the transmission now. Most transmissions have a gold tip and a silver body. The gold tip will go into the bottom section of your pin blank on the opposite end of the pin nib. Next, you want to take your pin cartridge and make sure that it simply finger tightens and screws into the transmission. You can also test the twisting mechanism of the transmission to make sure that the pin cartridge protrudes out of the pin nib as it is supposed to when you're using the pin. After this, you can take the pin clip and the pin end stock, or the tip, the back end of the pin. The back end tip part will go through the pin clip into the top portion of the pin. Next, you can take your middle spacer. Usually you can push this on the transmission by hand and don't need a press. After you have the middle spacer installed, you're ready to fully assemble the pin by taking the back piece and simply installing it on the front piece. Again, you shouldn't need too much pressure to do this. A lot of times you can just do it by hand. After all of the parts and pieces together, your finished product is beautiful. You should be able to twist the pin, open it correctly. You might have to take the wax off the tip of the pin if applied. And then you're ready to sell your pin or keep it or gift it to somebody or whatever you decide to do. Thank you for watching this video. I appreciate your support, and if you have any questions or comments about methods that I use, feel free to leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and you can catch me on Twitter @TheNickHarrison. Thank you for watching.